Okay, good afternoon, good morning, South and North Americas, and good day, Australia. I know you will watch this, the recording of this webinar later, as it is too late or too early to join live. I am Dominique Lazarski, I chair UECNA, the European umbrella organization fighting aircraft pollution. Welcome to this new webinar on the external cost of aviation. We have all seen reports from famous consultancy firms showing how much aviation benefits to countries and regions. Most are built on a model designed for SEI, the airport lobby, or for IATA, the airline lobby. They tend to magnify the impact of aviation and include not only direct or indirect benefits, but also induced and catalytic benefits. So the baguette bought by the au pair looking after the children of someone working in a hotel in a town connected to other parts of the world by an airport is part of the economic impact of aviation. What all these reports, and I really mean all of them, what they all miss is the negative externalities, those borne by the society. They add the pluses but forget the minuses. When a political decision has to be taken, however, regarding an industry having such an impact on the environment as aviation has, it should be based on a cost-benefit analysis, not just benefits analysis. Negative externalities must then also be taken into consideration, and our two guests today will explain to you all you want to know about how externalities can be valued. John Stewart, UECNA's Vice Chair, will be our moderator for the discussion following a presentation, and Eleftheria, UECNA's Treasurer. You have the floor now to present Arno, Schroten, and Stefan Grebe.
Thank you, Dominique. I will present the gentleman that who will speak for us this afternoon. And I have to say about Arno Schroten that he's a manager of mobility and transport and a team leader in transport economics. He's an expert in external and infrastructure costs in mobility and transport, economic instruments for greening mobility and transport, and economic analysis of the mobility and transport sector. And Mr. Stefan Grebe is between 2014 and 2020. He worked as a researcher in an institute specialized in quantitative research on mobility and transport. And in September 2020, he joined CE Delft's Mobility and Transport Department as senior researcher and consultant and theme leader in aviation. CE Delft is one of the most respected consultancies in Europe on the topic of environmental economics. And gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to tell you this afternoon something about the monetary cost of aviation noise. Let's go to the next slide. It works. Yes, there it is. I would like to briefly introduce the company we both working at, which is CE Delft. It's an independent research and consultancy agency founded in 1978. We are with 85 employees at the moment around, and we are based in Delft in the Netherlands. Our work is focused on environmental policy in general, and particularly on climate change, but also on other environmental issues like air pollution and noise. And we do that for a broad range of areas. On transport, that's where Stefan and I both work, but also on energy-related issues, and it can be on the supply of energy, on supply of electricity, for example, or gas, but also on the demand for energy by households or by industry and resources. And we have know-how in our agency on economics, but also on the technological side of of these issues and on policy issues. And we work for a broad range of clients. We do a lot of work for the governments, and these are both the international governments like the European Commission, the European Parliament, but also regional and local governments. But we also work for industries and for NGOs. So we try to do assignments for everyone who is interested in this kind of issues. Then let's move to the topic of today, the monetary cost of aviation noise. As was already said before, noise is one type of external cost of transport. And what are external costs? External costs are the cost of mobility, which are borne by other parties than the ones causing them. And in this respect, they are different from internal costs, like, for example, fuel costs. If you have fuel costs, these are costs that are borne by the ones who drive the car or fly with the airplane. But it's not the case with external costs. If you look at, for example, noise, then these are caused by transport users, but are borne by people, for example, living near an airport or living near a road. So that's an important difference, because as these external costs are not borne by the ones who are causing them, they will not take them into consideration when they make a transport decision. If they have to decide, will I travel to a village, yes or no, they will not take these costs into consideration. And for that reason, you will end up with suboptimal mobility patterns. You will have too much transport demand, or you will have a choice for transport modes that are not really sustainable. That's one issue. Another issue with respect to externalities, which is closely related to this, is that externalities are not traded on markets. And this is also different from internal costs like fuel cost. If you look at fuel cost, there is a fuel market, and demand and supply on the fuel market determines the price for fuel. And there you have your price for fuel. But if you look at noise, there is no market for noise. So there is no market price that exists for noise, or for air pollution, or for climate change, for all the externalities. And for that reason, they will not be taken into consideration by transport users. And to solve this, you need alternative approaches to determine the economic value of these external costs. And you do have some methods to do that, and I will present some of them in a minute. But yeah, and we have done quite a lot of studies on this, and you see on this slide some examples of studies we have done. And for your information, you can find all these studies on our website, because all we do, or almost all the studies we do, can be downloaded for free on our website. Looking at external costs, what are the most relevant external costs of aviation? These are climate change, air pollution, and noise. And noise is the topic we are talking about today mostly. So therefore, I would like to focus on noise. And first, if you are talking about the externalities of noise, you have to consider what are the negative impacts of aviation noise. What are the elements of these external costs? And there are two main impacts of aviation noise that are regularly included in external cost estimates of noise. And these are annoyance and the health impacts. And I will come back to both in a minute on the next slide. There are also some other potential impacts which are currently not included in cost estimates. So this is good to have in mind if we look at the results. And the first one is production losses. For example, people can, because of noise, can concentrate less, or they will sleep less, and as a consequence, they will be less productive on their job. These are, and all the costs related to that these can be categorized under production losses. This impact is not considered in cost estimates because there is a lot of overlap with health impacts and annoyance. So it's difficult to identify what is unique on this one, and therefore it's often not included in cost estimates. Another potential impact of noise is disturbances of quiet areas, for example, parks. And these areas, the welfare of visiting these areas, visiting a park can be lower because of noise. And this is a second potential impact. Then we have effects on ecosystems. There is some evidence that noise can also have an impact on wildlife, on breeding patterns of birds, for example, which have negative impacts. And the final one are the cordons sanitaires, which is mostly related to the fact that there are all kinds of restrictions around airports, for example, with respect to building houses. And this has economic cost, as you cannot build in the neighborhood of an airport. All these 4 impacts are not included, as I said, in estimation of external cost of noise, and mainly because there is not much evidence yet on how large they are, how you should monetize them. So they are not included. It's also good to know that compared to annoyance and health impacts, they are probably quite small. So I think that by including annoyance and health impacts, you do have the major part of the external cost, but there are still missing some smaller parts of it. Then let's focus on these 2 most important impacts of noise. First of all, the cost of annoyance. Annoyance is defined by the World Health Organization as the disturbance of individuals experience when they are exposed to traffic noise, and it can hinder people in performing certain activities, which may lead to a variety of negative responses, like disappointment, anxiety, and exhaustion. The World Health Organization recommends a limit of aviation noise at 45 dB. But it's good to mention here that even below 45 dB, people are annoyed as well. There are quite some studies that show that also between 40 and 45 dB, there are people annoyed by aviation noise. It's also good to know that in most economic valuation studies, there is an even higher threshold use of 50 or even 55 dB. And that is because it is often there are not many studies who present valuation figures for noise cost below 50 dB because they say that it's not reliable, and there is also often not much data on the number of people who are exposed to noise below 50 or 55 dB, at least at the aggregate level, if you look at a country in total or the EU in total. So, but because of this relatively high threshold, what you see is that in many studies, the noise costs are, the estimates of the noise costs are quite conservative. And I will come back to that later as well. Then I mentioned before that there will be no market price for noise. So we need alternative methods to evaluate annoyance cost. And in principle, we have 3 different approaches you could use. And I've listed them here and I will discuss them. The first one is a stated preference approach. And in the stated preference approach, you use questionnaires or experiments to derive a respondent's willingness to pay to lower noise annoyance levels. And based on that, you derive their economic value of noise. There are 2 main approaches here. The contingent valuation, and this is an approach where you use surveys to ask people for their willingness to pay, or you can make use of a choice experiment. And in a choice experiment, you present different alternatives to people, and you ask them to select the one they prefer. And these alternatives For example, if you want to buy house A or house B, and then these alternatives, house A and house B, differ on different elements. And these different elements could, for example, be the location of the house, the price of the house, but also the noise level that the house is exposed to. And based on this information, and if you have enough people making this choice between those two, you can use econometric methods to derive the economic value people have for noise, or for lower noise levels. That's the first approach. The second approach is the revealed preference approach, and there you derive the monetary value of noise, in this case, from transactions on other markets. So this is based on real life transactions, and that's a real difference between the first two. And the most popular revealed preference approach is hedonic pricing. And hedonic pricing is a method that looks at housing prices, transactions in houses, and the prices that come from those transactions. And what they try to do is to identify what is the impact of noise levels on housing prices. And they do that by comparing a lot of different houses and identify all kinds of attributes of these houses, including noise levels, and try to isolate the impact of noise on the housing price. And then finally, we have the environmental burden of disease approach, which is an approach that is particularly used for monitoring the health impacts of noise, but in some cases it's also used for annoyance. And the central element of this approach is the disability adjusted life year, the daily. And the daily can be defined as one lost year of healthy life. So if you are dead, then the daily is 1. And oh no, sorry, I'm wrong. Let me explain it in a different way. To define this dailies, the number of dailies from noise, you look at the number of people that are exposed to noise, and with respect to annoyance, because you look at the number of people that are highly annoyed by noise, and then you multiply them with the disability rate. And this disability rate reflects the severity of the disease on a scale from 0, which is a situation wherein you have a perfect health, to 1. And in the case of 1, you are dead. And in this way, you can, and this disability rate, that is a factor that is defined, or the value of this factor is defined by a group of scientists who together define this the value of this disability rate. And using this disability rate, you can estimate the number of dalis that relates to a certain noise level, and then you can, and the next time you can monitorize these dalis with the value of a life year lost. And in this way you can estimate the external cost of annoyance due to noise. If there are more detailed questions, I would like to answer them after our presentation. Then, what's the preferred approach? First of all, I have to say that all 3 methods are used in practice. And it also depends a bit on the country you are living in. For example, in the UK, they are using the environmental burden disease approach. In the Netherlands, we make use of the stated preference approach, while I know that in Switzerland, they make use of the revealed preference approach. So all types of approaches are used, but they all have their own advantages and disadvantages. If you look at stated preference, a big advantage there is that it is done in a controlled area, in a controlled environment. So you can control for all external factors. And what you can also do, you can quite good take non-linear patterns of willingness to pay values into account. And this is something that we see from recent studies, that there is a non-linear pattern between the willingness to pay of people and the noise levels. And what people at high noise levels, or very high noise levels, the willingness to pay is much higher than at low noise levels. And it also increases not linearly, but it increases progressively. The stated preference also have some disadvantages. And the first one, and actually, they are all quite related to the fact that they are hypothetical situations where you're looking at. You're asking people on a hypothetical situation. And then there is the risk that people are strategically in answering this questions. And your results also depends very much on the design of your experiment or your survey. Looking at refill preference, then the advantage is that it is based on actual behavior. So you have no strategic answers. It doesn't depend that much on how how it is designed. But it is very difficult to isolate the impact of one externality of noise, in this case, on housing prices, for example, if you use hedonic pricing. And in these kind of methods, it's often a linear relation between willingness to pay and noise levels is assumed. And as I said before, this is not in line with the most recent insights on this issue. And finally, we have the environmental burden disease approach. A large advantage there is that it is consistent with the valuation of the health impacts. But on the other hand, there are large uncertainties on this disability rates, particularly for noise. And this disability rates are only available for highly annoyed people. So people that are moderately annoyed are not taken into account with this approach, which results in underestimation of the annoyance cost. From studies, we know that the results from all three approaches are in the same range, but at the same time, there is quite a large bandwidth. But all these results, you cannot say that one of these approaches leads to much lower or much higher results than the other two. And in our EU handbook that we have produced in 2019, we recommend to use values based on the stated preference methodology. And that is mainly also because this nonlinear pattern that you can cover with this approach. Then that was the noise. Then the second part of external cost of noise exists of the health cost of aviation noise. And as you maybe know, noise may cause several health impacts. And I listed here some of them. Most important, some heart diseases. It can contribute to hypertension, to stroke, to diabetes, to reduce cognitive abilities and sleep disturbance. The World Health Organization concludes in 2018, based on very much different studies, that for aviation, if you look at aviation, that only for sleep disturbance, strong evidence is found. For some of the other health impacts, there is also evidence found, but this evidence is not very strong, but more moderate or even weak. And they say that if more research is done on this specific health impact, it could be the conclusion that the sign of the impact or the level of the cost level or the level of the impact would be much lower or much higher or would change. So in our estimations, we therefore only include health impacts for which strong evidence is found, which for noise is so only sleep disturbance. As I mentioned before, the environmental burden disease approach is most commonly used to evaluate health impacts of aviation noise. And yeah, particularly for our studies, as I said before, we use for the annoyance cost the stated preference approach. But then you have a potential interaction between sleep disturbance and annoyance, because if you ask people what they think about reducing noise and how that will impact their welfare, it's probably not possible for most of them, to distinguish between their impacts on annoyance and on sleep disturbance. So there is quite a high risk that there is an interaction there. And this also follows from several studies. So what we did is that we do not take sleep disturbance into account as health impact from noise in our external cost estimates. So a lot of talking about methodology, then let's look at the results. And these are the results we provided just beginning of this year for the Netherlands. But I think the results will be closely comparable for other countries. And what we see here, the environmental cost, the annual cost per person for different noise levels. And you see that we start at 45 dB, and then it increases. And at 80 dB, it's more than 5,000 euros per person per year. But you also see here that it is progressive. So the higher the noise level, the increase in annual cost here. And you also see that the noise from aviation is valued higher than noise from road and rail. And this is because people are more annoyed at the same noise level by aviation noise than by road or rail noise. Then let me say it a bit in a context by comparing the noise cost to other external costs, and also make a comparison between the different modes. This is from a study we did in 2019, and it shows the situation for the external cost of transport in the EU 28 and 2016. And here we see that for aviation, the total external cost in Europe are about 50 billion euros per year. This is much lower than, for example, for a car, but this is not surprising, I guess, because we have much more cars and much more car travel than aviation traveling. What we also see here, and is that if you look at aviation, that the main externalities for aviation are climate cost and the cost of well-to-tank emissions. And well-to-tank emissions are the emissions that are emitted at producing the fuels, so the kerosene for aviation. And these two are both taking a large part of the total cost of aviation, the total external cost of aviation. And the noise costs are around 1 billion euro. Here I have to say that this is a conservative estimate, as we only had data for the number of people exposed to noise above, I thought it was 55 dB. So all the people below 55 dB are not included in this figure. So this, I expect that the noise cost, if you take them into account, would be significantly higher, but there was no data for that. Then, if we zoom in and look at the external cost of a specific trip, and this is a trip from Amsterdam to Paris, and there we compared the cost, the external cost on a two-way trip for one person. And then we see that per person kilometer, the external costs for an airplane are much higher than for a passenger car, a bus, and a train. And they are around 60-65 euros per person on a two-way trip. And what we also see here again is that the cost of climate change and well-to-wheel emissions are highest, but also, and this is because, but that noise and air pollution costs are also significant, but lower. And if you compare this for a short haul flight and a long haul flight, and here I made a comparison between Amsterdam Paris and Amsterdam Toronto, and you see that on the short haul flights, noise and air pollution, which are quite local impacts, have a significant impact. Noise, the contribution of noise to the total external cost here are 10%, while on a long haul flight, it's very low, the contribution of noise, which is understandable because there most costs are related to the kilometer related costs like climate change and well-to-tank emissions. I think this was it. Yes. Then I would like to hand over to Stefan.
Yes, thanks, Arno. So the good thing for you is that you have now passed the most difficult part and also the longer first half. So now we will actually apply the theory to practice. And what I've shown in these two figures here is on the left-hand side that the individual aircrafts have become much more silent over time. So if we compare the emissions from an individual aircraft in 1950 with one approximately 2020, when we see that the emissions have been reduced by about 88%. So this is good news for people living around airports. The bad news is that the demand over the time has increased much more than the aircraft have become more silent. And what you see is that the development of aircraft emissions seems to flatten out. So it is more and more difficult to produce aircraft that emit less noise. But on the other hand, you see these almost exponential growth of demand in passengers. If you look at the figure for aircraft, it is a little bit better because aircrafts are becoming bigger on average, so the number of seats increases, but the figure is very similar. And at an individual airport, you can kind of multiply these figures, and then you end up with the development of the noise in the surroundings. And I've shown here the figures for Schiphol Airport, so Amsterdam Airport. And what you see on the left-hand side is the number of households that how this develops for severe noise load. So this is the 48 dB contour. So then we count how many households are inside this contour, and then we index it to 2004 in this figure, and then you see that over time the noise exposure has been increasing, and it has been increasing for actually two reasons. So in the dashed line you see really the increase in aircraft movements, and in the solid line you see that there are more people living there. So this adds up to the noise exposure of people. And what you also see that if you look at severe sleep disturbances, then it is almost constant over time. And this has to do with a reduction of night flights. And actually it has been constant, and afterwards there's also a reduction in night flights. So on the left-hand side, an increase in number of aircraft movements at Schiphol leads to an increase, but because there's a limit on night flights, then you see a different pattern there. And then on the next figure, I want to show a little, give you a feeling about how big actually are these contours we are talking about and how many people are affected. So on the left-hand side, there are the noise contours for 48 to 58. And then you see this is covering a large part of the province of North Holland. So you see in gray, dark gray, these are the cities in the Netherlands. So on the north east, the dark area, that is Amsterdam. And you see that on the south west, you see in dark the city of The Hague. So it's really covering a large part of the country. And if you look at the number of households between 48 and 55 dB, then we talk about 236,000. So it's really a large amount of people that are affected by noise. if you look at the region 58 and more decibel, then you see that this is much more located around the 5 runways of Schiphol. And what you also see there, that this is mainly trying to is mainly around the city. So with the departure and arrival procedures, of course, airports try to minimize the impact, and that you see that these very heavy noise emissions are mainly in areas where not so many people live, but of course you also see there about 50-80 dB, there are still like 10,000 households with these noise exposures. And on the right, you see the similar figures for the disturbance during the night. And the question is now, what are actually the possibilities to reduce aircraft noise? And in principle, we distinguish 4 methods. So what you can do, a noise reduction at the source. This is covering everything from the aircraft technology, mainly the figure which I started with, aircraft become more silent due to technological improvements. The second possibility is town and country planning. So this means you just don't build new houses around airports, or you improve the noise isolation of houses. Of course, this only helps for people when they are inside and have closed windows, and not if they are barbecuing in the garden. The third possibility is operational measures. This is mainly about flight trajectories and one-way usage. So if you use the runways in the best possible configuration, and at Schiphol you have many possible configurations because of the situation that there are 5 runways, the noise exposure can be reduced. And of course, this has to be possible with the weather conditions and safety, operational safety. And the fourth possibility, what you have to reduce aircraft noise, is utilization restrictions, and there are many flavors. You can say that some aircraft types are not allowed to use the airport. You can do utilization restriction during different daytimes, or a general cap on the number of aircraft movements. And if you have followed a little bit the news on Amsterdam Airport Schiphol, then there's a lot of discussion on that, and I will have one slide on the Schiphol announcement, because yeah, this is really a game changer in the Netherlands. And what is important to note, that if you look at the noise impact, that noise emissions during the night have a higher impact, and therefore they are also evaluated higher in social cost benefit analysis. And here on the bottom of the slide, I have summarized the results of a study of the effectiveness of different measures to reduce noise during the night. So what you see in the figure are 4 scenarios, from left to right, with 32,000 aircraft movements, and then a reduction to 29,000, 27,000, and 25,000. And then you see the effect on the number of households that have a severe noise load of 48 dB and severe sleep disturbance of 40 dB during the night. And what you see in this table are the cost for airlines that it would lead to if you reduce the number of night slots. And what you see is if you go from 32,000 to 29,000, then the costs are approximately 5,500 euro per year per sleep disturbance reduction, and that it increases to higher amounts if you reduce the number of night slots to 25,000. So what you see here, so these costs for airlines, they are about 5,500 euro, and that is comparable to the cost that Arno showed, a rather high amount. But maybe we can discuss this afterwards. Here is an example of a social cost benefit analysis where we have taken the effect of aircraft noise into account. So in the introduction it was said it is never done, and we usually do we do it, and we always do it. In this study, three alternatives are compared. There is a baseline scenario which assumes 500,000 aircraft movements at Schiphol constant over time, and then we compare it to a decrease to 375,000 flights and a growth alternative to 140,000 flights. And the figures and the table, they are for the economic low scenario, but we have also evaluated for the economic high scenario, but there the results are very similar. So it's really enough to show it here in one example. And in the figure, you see the number of households within the 58 dB contour. So these are really the people that are heavily affected. And then you see it starts at around 9,000 in 2018. You clearly see the effect of the corona pandemic, where the number of aircraft movements has been reduced significantly. So also the number of people affected was reduced significantly. And then we modeled a recovery and then these three scenarios. And then you see the difference that in these scenarios of 540 and 500,000, it increases to 9,000 households. And then you see the effect of the technological improvement. Aircraft become more silent, but there is a cap on the number of aircraft movements. So the total noise is reduced. And of course, it is reduced much more in this scenario with 375,000 flights. But such a capacity restriction has a lot of effects. And in this table, I summarize them. And these are the direct effects, the indirect effect, and the external effects. And I don't want to go through all the numbers, but in principle, it is the case that the noise impacts are rather small compared to the other effects, especially if you compare to the climate effect. You see, climate effect for this reduction to 375,000 is 3.9 billion euros, whereas the noise impact is 0.4. And in this study, we have taken into account all households above 50 dB, and that we would have liked to go much lower, but in the modeling, there was no data available what would be the effect on it. And we are currently doing an additional cost-benefit analysis, which is not published yet. And there we go down to 45 dB. So we follow the guidelines of the World Health Organization. But what is important to conclude here from this slide is a reduction of the capacity really has a lot of effect on noise. You see it here, the number of households is strongly affected, but if you compare to the climate effect, then the noise impact is much smaller. And this is also, of course, what you have seen in the external cost comparison that Arno showed at the end of his part. Just before we come to the conclusions, I would like to summarize the Schiphol announcement from approximately 1 month ago. And they made an announcement that Schiphol wants to be more in balance with the living environment. And the goal is a quieter, cleaner, and better Schiphol. And for that, as this sounds like a typical plan that you find in glossy magazines, but they really seem to change from what we are used from airports. So they said there'll be new rules for clear limits for noise and CO2 emissions. They are not worked out yet, but they are really working on it. They say that the noisiest aircraft types, they will not longer be welcome. There is a night closure for Schiphol for takeoffs between midnight and 6 in the morning and no landings between midnight and 5. They will forbid private jet and small business aviation at Schiphol. There was always the possibility to build an additional 6th runway, and they say we will not do it anymore, so the land can get another purpose. There will be an annual investment of 10 million in a local environment and residents. Think about isolation of houses, and they want to safeguard cargo, which is important for cargo and people first. But the last two ones are maybe not so important. But a night closure, especially for people really living close to it and having the sleep disturbance, this will really make a big change. Then I come to the conclusions. Maybe you want to start with your points?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, as we saw, aviation noise results in high levels of annoyance. We also saw that there is some evidence for a health impacts, but that the evidence there is still limited. And because of that, they are often not included in external cost values. By using economic methods, environmental price for aviation noise can be determined, and I have explained how you can do that. And if you use those environmental prices, you can calculate that the social cost of aviation noise in Europe is at least 1 billion euro, I think that we should say. Because as I mentioned before, we only looked at the situation for people living or experiencing noise levels above 55 dB. So it will be much higher, this figure, as Stefan showed. A lot of people are living in an environment where the noise levels are between 45 and 55 dB. Stefan?
Yes, then we have seen there has been a lot of technological improvement in aircraft, so they have become more quiet. However, the noise has increased due to the strong growth in the number of aircraft movements. There are different measures possible to reduce the aircraft noise, and noise has an impact in social cost-benefit analysis, but generally we can state that it is much less than the climate impact of aviation. And now we want to thank you for your attention and are interested, of course, in your questions.
Thank you both very much indeed. You can probably stop sharing the screen now, and everybody will magically then come up on the screen. We're running, as you know, today a little bit longer, so we've got a fair bit of time for questions and comments. If you want to show your camera, that would be great, because it's nice to see faces on the screen. If you don't, and you're in the middle of eating something, that's perfectly understandable, but everybody is showing their faces, which is nice because it makes it, we can relate to each other much more easily. As I say, we've got a fair bit of time for questions and comments, and just to thank you both very much indeed. That was hugely, hugely informative. What I always say at this stage is that don't worry if English is not your native language and you're not very comfortable speaking in English. That applies to probably most people on the call. Doesn't apply to myself because I live in London and I'm a native English speaker. But listen, if you want to make your point, you're amongst friends if you speak in hesitant English, so don't worry about it. Probably best if you put up your virtual hand in order to speak. If you can't do that, just put up your real hand, and that'd be equally fine. And if I don't spot you, because there's actually a lot of people on the call and everyone's not on my screen, just start talking, and that'll be fine as well. So, who would like to? Actually, there's one very specific question that came up in the chat, Arno. It was when you were showing the total external cost chart. Somebody asked what MC meant.
Motorcycle.
Motorcycles, of course. Yes. Oh, listen, aren't we being dim? Of course. Yes. Right. Now, a sensible question. Dave, you go first, and then Jamie.
Thanks. Hi, it's Dave Gill here from London. Been overflown by Heathrow at the moment. I wasn't too clear about what noise impacts you were considering. Was it just sleep, or was it sleep and annoyance? In the UK, the DFT value both sleep disturbance and annoyance in the way they evaluate economic disbenefits. And I understand that the annoyance evidence is moderate, according to the WHO 2018 report, which is actually quite a strong position relative to other information. And it's not surprising it's moderate anyway, because we're using these average LAQs or LDENs to try and describe noise. And we know that a lot of other factors actually involved. So is it just one of those two aspects you're using in your noise evaluation, or both? Thank you.
In our study, we only use annoyance because we said that there is a quite high risk that with annoyance scores based on stated preference research, that there is an overlap between annoyance and sleep disturbance. I know that in the UK, this is done differently, because in the UK, this is both annoyance and sleep disturbance are based on the environmental burden disease approach, and then you can then you can separate both aspects, and you can combine both. But we have made this comparison between our approach and the UK approach. And what you find then is that by only taking into account annoyance based on stated preference studies, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, using the environmental burden disease approach, taking into account both annoyance and sleep disturbance, results in almost the same cost estimates. So it seems, and this is some kind of proof for our assumption that in the stated preference cost estimates for annoyance, sleep disturbance is included.
Okay, thanks. That's understandable. So if we are doing evaluations in the UK, we should use, and if we're using the economic burden of disease approach, we should value annoyance and sleep disturbance.
Yes, then you can combine both. Yes.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, Dave. Jamie, and then we've got Debbie and Bob. Jamie, on you go. You're on mute, Jamie.
Hi, I'm Jamie Banks from Quiet Communities in the States. Thank you for the presentation. One of the questions I had about the use of sleep disturbance is, does it consider the long-term consequences, health consequences, and those direct costs? Those would include cardiovascular disease, cardiometabolic disturbances, cognitive productivity, things. It's, like sleep disturbance is a marker for these other long-term effects. So that's one question. The other question I had was regarding, is there any use of the quality adjusted life year in looking at economic impacts of noise?
With respect to the second question, I'm not sure. I know that quality adjusted life years are quite closely related to disability adjusted life years, and this is the metric that is used most often. But maybe there are studies that are also using the quality adjusted life years. I'm not sure. And your first question on sleep disturbance, I think in the World Health Organization, they do take into account these other impacts that are related to that, but I'm not completely sure how they differentiate between them, because they also consider these health impacts like heart diseases separately. So somewhere they make a distinction between both, and I'm not completely sure how they do it. This is something that should be in the World Health Organization studies.
Yeah, because there's ways, there's ways typically things like cost effectiveness studies that are done for medical interventions will look, they model, from a short-term outcome, those long-term consequences. So
Yes.
It's not just a decrease in blood pressure, but how does that translate to reductions in heart attacks, stroke, et cetera? And I think if you did that kind of analysis, looking at sleep disturbance, and then those longer term effects, the results might be quite different.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. That's a really interesting point. Debbie.
Hi, thanks so
Welcome.
much. Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of comments. One is at the A&E, John, the industry typically stated many times how much quieter the aircraft have become. And I noticed they don't address really anything other than the A-weighted sound levels. So in other words, what we perceive from our ears as the louder noise from aircraft is considered in the DNL, the day-night level. But there is other noise going on, lower frequency noise and vibration, which when they originally did the, noise policies, they centered it around the A-weighted sound level. And there's never been an update to consider the lower frequency and vibration, which one researcher has found causes cell and tissue damage. So I wanted to the speakers to address that, whether or not they would look further into that, or there's very little research on it, for good reason, likely. But it's an important consideration that maybe the noise isn't quieter, it's different. So just a word of caution on that. And then also on the emissions, one of the presenters stated that there's been an 88% reduction in emissions. I also, since that's my area of research for the last 30 years, I would say that that's not true. Emissions have changed. When the engines were modified to reduce noise, they were also made to burn hotter and reduce carbon monoxide and some other things, dramatically increasing ultrafine particle levels and other emissions like NOx. So because the emission levels are so high, and operations, we've been able to look at operational differences in downturn in the economy in 2008 and the 9/11 era. So you can compare emissions per year on aircraft numbers, and you find that there is very little difference. And in fact, US fuel use has continued to climb dramatically. So it doesn't match up with more aircraft necessarily. So can your panel address those two issues, please? Where did they get the 88% reduction? Because that's definitely an industry talking point that isn't borne out in the data.
Okay, thanks for that, Debbie. I've lost you on the screen, but I'm sure you're somewhere here, Stefan and Arno. Yes, I can see you now. On you go.
I can start with the second question. So the 88%, I mean, this is was an illustrative figure comparing noise emission. It is not about CO2 emissions or fuel efficiency. And of course, you're completely right that the temperatures have changed and NOx emission have changed, but that is a completely different story. Individual aircrafts are really becoming more quiet. That's obvious. And the point that I wanted to make is that even though individual aircrafts have become more quiet, noise emissions have increased due to the growth in the number of aircraft movements. And and it is based on this dBA measure, and that is the industry standard, and therefore it is also used in all the modeling, because you can put the noise emission of the used engines in your models and estimate the noise exposure on the ground. And of course, there might be frequencies that are not considered, but for us, I mean, we are not the researchers on the noise modeling part. There, we have to build on the existing models.
Okay, thanks for that. Lots of hands going up. Bob, you're next.
Can I ask a follow-up question, John?
You can, yeah, you can, Debbie. Yes, and then Bob. Yes, on you go,
Okay.
Debbie.
So it depends to, I didn't hear the emission issue addressed. Noise has gone down, planes are quieter. I would hypothesize that the noise is different, but maybe more health impactful, kind of like how the emissions were changed, but maybe more impactful on health. If you estimate the emission reduction per passenger mile, you might be able to get a reduction because the planes are larger, carrying more people. But the fuel use has gone up per engine. These are larger engines, they burn more fuel. So I would ask that reduction figure, did it come per passenger mile, or where was it derived from? Thank you.
I think the source is in the figure, but and as far as I remember, it is really about the individual aircrafts. And I mean, this trend, I mean, how you define the noise impact, and you say it is different noise. I cannot comment on that. It's not my expertise. We use the noise certifications and the aircraft technologies that how the engines are specified, and they have noise emissions that are tested in the lab for the descent, for the approach, for the start of the cycle. And these numbers are used in the models.
Okay, thanks for that. Bob, on you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
You can indeed, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a Dutch researcher, and I'm currently working on the problem of aircraft noise. I've done some studies of my own on the effect of noise and the measures, the metrics LDEN and L-night. And as you all know, there's a trade-off between the peak levels in those metrics and the number of flights. As peak levels are getting lower, typically maybe a couple of dB. The flight numbers are increasing about, for 3 dB, it can be increased by 100% for the same LDEN value. Now, my question is, did the researchers look at these effects of increased frequency of passage? And I'm asking this in relation to the plans they have in our country, in the Netherlands, to concentrate flight paths in remote areas. And in a concentrated flight path, you'll get all the noise, I presume, much more noise, maybe at a slightly lower level in the future, but in a very much increased frequency. So, to my view, that may add to annoyance, particularly if one knows that a mile further away, people are not hearing anything. My question is, what is the effect of frequency on annoyance?
No, it's an interesting point and a very relevant point, I think, Bob, because the concentrated flight paths are coming in at all European airports, and as our American friends know, they've already come in at major airports in Europe, in America, and are causing great problems. Any thoughts, Stefan and Arno?
No, I actually don't know. I would assume that it doesn't matter in the way it is calculated right now, but I'm not 100% sure actually.
Okay,
Because
that's a straight. Sorry, go on.
I think how it works is that you add up noise emissions, and if you have, let's say, of course, it's a decibel scale, so it's not so easy, but in principle, 2 times half of the emission should be the same as 1 time full. I think this is how the modeling works, but actually, this is really deep in the noise modeling, and I'm not 100% sure how it is counted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a very honest answer. Martin, we'll go to you next, and then we'll go to Bertold, John, Dan have got their hands up. So Fiona is not Fiona. Fiona is Martin. So reveal yourself.
Mic on. Okay, good evening. Many thanks for that presentation. That was very helpful. And just picking up a few points subsequently. I mean, first of all, you'll probably see in the chat, I have an absolute abhorrent hatred of the word aeroplanes are now quieter. That's what the industry wants us to believe. My view is aeroplanes are noisy machines inherently. 50 yards from a jet engine, 130 decibels. Now that is not quiet. So I think we need to get away from soft language. We need to say airplanes are less noisy than they used to be from the old days of 707s. But when you look at, as Debbie and Bob mentioned, when you look at the decibel decrease, again, the industry says, oh, we've lost 3 dBs. And they claim 50% quieter. Wrong. Totally wrong. That's the noise frequency, and it's not the intensity. You've got to be 10 dBs quieter to halve the noise intensity. So all this soft language we need to combat. So for instance, the 737 MAX has come out again at last, and bigger and all the rest of it. And they're claiming, not unreasonably, that they are quieter by 50%. 3 decibels. You can't hear a difference of 3 decibels. So we need to combat all that, what I call soft language. Moving on to a couple of things that Debbie and Bob said. Yes, it's coming back to something John wrote many years ago about the 3 decibel, A-weighted con. Everything's measured in A-weighting because it's been standardized to that. But it's totally inappropriate for jet engines with a very large low frequency content, which travels further, penetrates building facades more, and all the rest that we know, has a very high vibration content. Plus, modern turbofan engines have a whine because that big fan on the front whines. Now, whine it gives rise to more irritation, and is recognised in British standards when you're looking at machinery in workplaces, which is why you have to have earphones where you've got a big machinery that has a whine. So all these things contribute. So I'm coming on to saying, back to CE Delft, what are you doing in terms of cumulative impacts on noise? Because my view on this, talking to my medical friends, is that the cumulative impacts on noise, be it irritation, be it sleep disturbance, be it interruption of kids' schooling, as per the ranch surveys, comes out in health impacts. So it all comes together on poorer health, and poorer health means, as we all know, higher spending on things that you really shouldn't be doing. So I have a feeling that we ought to concentrate on the cumulative impacts, and we could add even local air quality to that. And can we all join you? So anyway, there's the question. Are we looking at cumulative impacts? Because I think we need to bring that together. The industry, I know, having worked in it, wants to separate out and ring fence each of the downsides and try and deal with it one by one. I think our pressure should be on making it cumulative. I have one more thing to say, and I've now forgotten. It was something that.
Mr. Martin, we'll come back to your final point. We'll get Stefan and Arno just to address the points you've made.
Yeah, with respect to cumulative impacts or separate impacts, we are not medical experts. So we have to base our research and our study on the results of the World Health Organization on this issue. And I think this is the most respective studies that have been done on the medical issues. And based on that, we make our economic analysis. And as I mentioned before, we include all the impacts for which the World Health Organization finds strong evidence that they exist. And I fully admit that there are other impacts as well, health impacts, and that they are important. That together they are they may have a high cumulative impact, but evidence is still low on some of these impacts. So we are scientists, and we try to be objective, and that's also the reason that we do not like to take into account effects that are very uncertain. And that's the reason that we base our analysis based on impacts, health impacts, that for which there is a lot of evidence.
Thanks for that. Martin, have either you or you? Sorry.
The one thing I only want to add,
you go.
So what we see is that more and more effects are taken into account, and that, I mean, we started at above 55 dB and then we went down to 45. And I think if there is more research from the medical experts, this might get down further, and additional effects might be really analyzed in detail, and then they can be taken into account, but we are not there yet.
Thanks for that. Martin, you had another point. Have either you or Fiona remembered it?
Yes, and I've forgotten what it was in my enthusiasm. No, I come back to the main thrust of the presentation, which is monetizing, because I believe that is a very good way. So whether it's dailies, quailies, or what have you, that's a very good way of trying to enjoin the aviation industry and its sponsors to look at the economic impacts. And because they will always claim, and quite rightly, that the benefits of flying are huge in terms of economic impacts. And just come to one part of it, hence they want freight. But these days, we could say to them, well, that's fine. If you can show it has an economic impact and you don't use belly hold, you use dedicated freight, belly hold will be fine because you carry that in passenger jets, then show us why you need to fly at night. And we can say, on the other hand, we will charge you more to fly at night, or the landing charges should be higher at night to encourage airlines to fly in the day around airports. Obviously, you can't do that worldwide, but as far as local airports are concerned operating, which is where the annoyance is, why don't we have lower landing charges during the day or higher landing charges at night? So there's a financial lever. That was my fifth principle, by the way, on top of your four. Use financial levers. And somebody I noticed in the chat said, yes, get them to charge VAT on airline tickets, get them to charge tax on fuel. All these things are financial levers, which you can add to the operational and technical levers that we can use in order to reduce the adverse impacts of flying. That was my second point.
Okay, thanks for that, Martin. What I'm going to suggest is, you don't need to come back on that, Stefan and Arno, right now. There are a number of hands up, and I'm afraid we might run a little bit short of time. So if people can keep their questions relatively short, that would be absolutely great, and then we'll get through everybody. So Bertold, good to see you again, and on you go, your question.
Yes, what I see is that important external costs are typically not taken into account, and the most critical external cost that I know is the reduced learning of children, which may have an impact on their ability to earn money on job, that they get less money than people who lived during school time in a quiet area. And this is really a very large amount, and it is related to night flight.
Thank you, Bertold. Arno, Stefan, do you want to briefly just make a comment on that?
Yes, if you have a study that shows that it is a very large impact, and which has a lot of and evidence that there is much evidence for it, please send it to us. But up to now, we only find studies that say that it may be an impact and that there may be a relation, but that the evidence is still weak. And as I explained before, that's the reason that we've not included it in our estimations. Because also, if you do that, then you make yourself very. It's very easy for opponents to attack us on our figures, because then they say you have included that, there is no evidence for it, and they will not believe anything at all anymore. So that's the reason that we only include things for which we have a lot of evidence. Okay,
thanks for that. John.
Good evening, everyone. I'm based in Southeast London, and we suffered the problem of low-level approach flights both into London City Airport and the double overflight issue with Heathrow aircraft also going over our rooftops. I found this illuminating. It's been splendid, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to follow through on something Martin said, 2 points. I think the monetization factor is long overdue. I'm glad to see it's materializing in such a way that we can actually begin to build it into some of the equations that we might include in our resistance to seeing expansion in some operations. John, you'll be very conscious of what we've been doing with London City Airport recently. But I would like to focus on one particular point, and that is how aircraft noise is measured around us here in London, and it may expand in its applicability to others. For the aircraft that we see going into London City Airport, we're dealing with aircraft that have been in service now for nearly 10 years. And the degree of reduction in noise in even the most recently introduced aircraft has been at an absolute minimum, 2 to 3 decibels, absolute maximum. And some of the positions that we've seen presented from the airport and the airports, plural, and the airline industry has been based upon design objectives. And we see all sorts of notional figures being thrown into the public domain, 50% reductions. Even someone at one airport who has to remain nameless recently restated he thought it was a 70% improvement. In practice, what we see are noise contour models produced from computerized systems, and we see very little field data produced from field measurement exercises, particularly here in the UK. I'd be intrigued to know whether others experience the same problem in their own countries. But here in the UK, we find it very difficult to establish hard factual evidence that flows from field measurement data, i.e. what the aircraft are doing in our vicinity. And I think that's quite crucial. I genuinely believe that we've seen a very significant reduction in noise levels from the 707 days. But I think in the last 10 years, we have seen it flatlining. It hasn't improved. New aircraft engines, new technologies, airframe improvements are not actually delivering noise reductions that are being claimed. And I think that needs to be taken into account. And I would invite Stefan to comment on whether he thinks he's found field measurement data that he feels he can rely upon.
It is very difficult, really. Also in the Netherlands, the situation. I mean, there are around Schiphol field measurement stations, and the modeling is compared to the field measurement. But still, this is a very difficult issue. So in that sense, also our results are always based on the available and validated models.
Okay, thanks for that. Dan, welcome back.
Thank you, John. I'll keep my comment very short. A-weighting is entirely inappropriate for measuring engine noise or aviation noise. It derives, my understanding is, from the 1972 National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health noise criteria. Hearing loss is a compensable workplace injury that's determined in practice by limited pure tone audiometry, first 1 to 4 kilohertz, then I think 1 to 6 kilohertz. My own personal aircraft cabin measurement, noise measurements show about a 60 decibel difference between A rating and C weighting. C weighting would be much more appropriate, I think, for aviation noise. That being said, I would caution that any new measure of aviation noise, whether C weighting or number of noise events or number of noise events over a certain decibel threshold, be done in parallel with the A weighting, because otherwise I say, oh, we have this new measure, look how great everything is, and you won't be able to compare with the previous things. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dan. Another question really about the A weighting, C weighting, which to some extent you've covered, Stefan and Arno. Any further comments on that? Okay, thanks for that. Amel, you've got the last question. We reserved the best till last. On you go.
That's very kind, John. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. We had a 3-hour meeting with Heathrow Airport yesterday, and it was about night noise and really trying to ban night flights, which, you know, we've been trying for years to do. And actually what we did ask is Heathrow Airport is always talking about, you know, the benefits of night flights, but we don't know what the benefits are when you actually quantify it in pounds. And I actually did say to them yesterday, we need to actually know in pound and pence, what is the benefit of having night flights, and what are the costs to the NHS? Sorry, I live next to Heathrow Airport, should have said. And what are the costs of, heart attack and stroke, lack of sleep, and all the problem associated with health, and also the fact that Heathrow has acknowledged that a lot of the children around Heathrow Airport are actually 2 years behind in their learning because of the noise. That is actually unacceptable. There are no economic benefits when our children around Heathrow Airport are actually being affected to that extent. What was also said by Rick Norman, I think you probably know him, John. Rick was more or less blaming people for living near an airport. I mean, I just had to remind them that they are 77 at the end of this month, and people have been living around in this village for much longer than that. So we are now being blamed for actually living near Heathrow Airport. And as you know, John, because you knew my husband, in 1946, when Heathrow Airport started, you actually walked or you went by bike, because in those days you couldn't afford a car and there weren't any buses. So there wouldn't have been an airport if people hadn't started like that. So you had to live near the airport.
Okay, okay. We need to move on. We need.
So just wanted to make the point that that was very relevant today. Thank you for the presentation.
Okay, thanks for that, Armel. I think we're almost there. Dominique, this is a question rather than you saying goodbye to everybody.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
I want to wait for everyone to have. I have 1 minute for my question.
Go on.
In France, we had the French agency evaluating the cost of noise, and aviation noise was valued to 6.1 billion, of which 4 billion only for the Paris Charles de Gaulle airport, and this is far from your 1 billion figure on your last slide for the whole Europe. How come there's such a difference?
Honest, I have no idea, because I do not know that study. And if you can share it, I'm very curious to see what they have done.
Yes,
and why they come up with such a high figure.
They do include sanitary costs, plus some other social costs like loss of productivity, depreciation of property, it was very interesting, and this was published in 2021, so it is recent as well. And I will send it to you because I think there's a big gap here.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
and that was just attributed to noise, cost of noise.
Okay.
I'm very interested.
Great. Well, listen, we've come to the end of our time. Stefan and Arno, thanks so much for that. Really informative. And what it did, and it's always a sign of a good talk, it stimulated a lot of discussion in the chat, a lot of questions, and I think it was really very thought-provoking. And I think some of the things that came out was what Dominique touched on earlier. I think you're saying that sometimes your figures may be a little bit conservative because you're basing it really on proven scientific fact. And if some of the other studies, I think as Dominique's, or I think some of the American studies are possibly showing higher costs, they're probably taking things into account which you haven't taken into account for perhaps that reason. Is that about right?
I suspect that that's the case, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, if you've got studies you want to share with Stefan and Arno, feel free to do so. They can't. But I think we'll bring things to a close, and I'll just pass over to Dominique to thank everybody and tell us what happens next.
Well, thank you, Arno and Stefan. That was a great presentation, and it's such a useful topic. I mean, we need to discuss this because we need to answer to the industry with the same argument, and the argument are financial arguments. So really, we need to include this in our discussions with them, and show that we do suffer not only in our flesh but also in our wallets. So thanks a lot everyone for being for attending today.